Let's get our kids sick on purpose. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, there is a doctor/scientist in Cincinnati who works for the University of Cincinnati, one Jack Rubenstein, writing at Cincinnati.com. Lots of Cincinnati in this episode. And he is making the case that we are just postponing the inevitable if we continue with this safer at home, shelter in place kind of mindset, and that eventually we're going to have to start getting people sick. And why not start with the children, since the children are most likely to have the mildest symptoms, and their caregivers, which it would be relatively young adults, also are those who are least likely to demonstrate complications as a result of the COVID-19 or novel coronavirus infection. And he's basically saying, let's do this, and specifically in Ohio, which we won't go into detail in this episode because the rest of the world doesn't care about Ohio. But according to this doctor, he says that Ohio is best prepared to do this. Bill, it would seem to me that Americans would be unlikely to embrace the idea of intentionally infecting children in order to help the greater society. What do you think about this?
Well, I'm not sure he's exactly saying have them lick doorknobs, I think what he's basically saying is if we are eventually going to have to go back to work, and that among the first people we could release from quarantine would be young people. The disease really likes old people, and the number of people under the age of 9 or 10 that's been infected worldwide is just shockingly low. So from a scientific point of view, he's absolutely correct.
Well, and I'm not so sure he's not talking about having people, metaphorically lick doorknobs.
You're saying
he literally
go
says
out
this
and infect them.
Let me quote him. Okay, this is from his article. We need to start exposing people to the virus, and what better place to start than with the group that is least vulnerable, children, and in the state that is best prepared, Ohio.
Exposing people to the virus is not the same as infecting them intentionally. So it's not a question of him taking kids down there into the dungeon and giving them COVID-19. And what he's basically saying is, and from a scientific point, I think he's right, and I think he's right as well. I'll resolve. If you just give me 1 second, I'll resolve this thing. I think morally, if it was a question of him saying we don't have a vaccine, but we know that this disease is not terribly dangerous among young people statistically, so therefore we're going to intentionally infect them, I think that'd be up to the individual parents. But the fact of what he's saying is correct. We are eventually going to have to go back out into this world, and we need to do that now. So I guess what he's saying is closing schools is probably not reopening schools should not be the last thing we do. Let me just put it as Bill, carefully as I possibly can.
If he were only stating that, I don't think I would have even brought this as a topic. But he's specifically saying, and a lot of this is based on the premise that if you get infected with a disease, your body's immune system rises up, and therefore you're more resistant in the future. And the more resistant people we have in the general population, the better off we are. So he's essentially saying, let's manage the flow to the hospitals, essentially, by starting with the youngest, who are least likely to wind up in the hospitals. But ultimately, the implication is, let's carry this through and make sure we get as many people infected as possible.
Well, that's the ultimate solution is the herd immunity. I'll talk about that in just a second. It's not, and it's not just children, Scott. It's young people. People under 30 have essentially zero risk. You will occasionally hear stories about somebody, but because you're hearing stories about them is an indication that those are basically extremely unusual. So to the degree that we should be letting young people basically go back to normal life before older people, that makes sense to me. As far as the idea of intentionally infecting their children, I don't think that's what he's saying. He's saying, let's get them out into the world and let them start with this herd immunity process. So everybody's talking about herd immunity, and I don't know if too many people fully understand it. So let me just give you a brief analogy I came up with. Here in California, we have an enormous problem with wildfires every year. And the reason we have a problem with wildfires is we have very, very dense brush that grows on the hills. And since it doesn't rain out here for 9 months, it grows spectacularly in the spring. And then towards the end of the year, what you've got are just entire hillsides that are just filled with perfect tinder, absolutely dried, very dense, very thin bushes. So it's perfect. It's a perfect fire medium. So if you assume that those bushes are a virgin population like the one that we have with COVID-19, in other words, there's no protection at all, you put a fire into that hillside filled with dried brush, and the fire goes from one to the next and just explosively covers thousands of acres. The idea of herd immunity is to say, well, what happens if every other bush were green and healthy and wouldn't catch fire? Well, if you started a fire in a dry bush, it would still catch fire, but it'd have a much more difficult time spreading because it has to jump over the healthy trees. You've basically cut the fuel available to the fire in half. And when you get somewhere around the point of 85, 90%, let's say 90% for this disease, now you're imagining a hillside where every 10th bush is dry. The other ones are healthy and green, and they cannot catch fire. And then you can see that no matter where you light that fire, it's virtually impossible for the fire to spread. It's certainly impossible for it to grow. So all it really is herd immunity is a question of fuel density, where people without immunity are the fuel for the virus. And once you have the virus and develop the antibodies, become immune to this particular virus, then you no longer are capable of transmitting it or being infected by it. So that's the idea of herd immunity. Once you get enough people recovered from the disease with antibodies, then the virus cannot jump through the population. Individuals can still get infected, but it can't simply spread the way that it did before. So that's obviously the goal until a vaccine comes along. And yes, he's making perfect sense. The youngest people are the ones who are least at risk. And the way that the story is structured, it makes it sound kind of like he's talking about pitching children into a virus pit. But I think what he's really doing is simply saying that from a statistical point of view, these are the first people that we should be encouraging to get back out there into the world. They've got the best chance of contracting the disease asymptomatically, meaning they may never even know they've got it. They simply got it and develop immunity to it. That's the big question right now, is how many asymptomatic immune people are out there. That's the issue right now. So not just children, but young people as well. I think certainly the common sense answer to this is to get people out there as quickly as possible. And it makes sense to me, and it certainly seems to be what he's saying, that the people who we should be getting out there first are the people who are least susceptible to serious complications. And that is, as that continues to develop, we basically try to protect our most at-risk populations until we can develop enough of that herd immunity to stop this wildfire spread.
Well, Bill, as you say that, and as Jack Rubenstein writes this at Cincinnati.com, it all sounds very science-y in the abstract, but there's a different thing from being scientific sounding in the abstract and talking about masses of people and saying to one mother, hey, look, we want you to send your kid out there with a fairly good likelihood that he's going to get an infection, probably have mild symptoms, and if it should get severe, well, we're going to phase this so that we can handle him. We'll have enough resources at the local hospital. Ohio's really good at tracking these things. And to say that to an actual mother about her specific child, I think is a whole different matter. Do you think that Americans are really going to say, well, yes, for the greater good, like the Chinese Communist government would expect you to do? Yes, we will sacrifice and risk our children for the greater good.
We're not talking about bubonic plague, Scott. We're not talking about plague. We're not talking about yellow fever. We're not talking about typhus. We're not talking about any of that
But we are talking about a disease that these parents have seen every single day on TV, a mounting death count, a mounting case count. And now as we record this, some 42,000 Americans having died from this condition. And you're going to say to mom, by the way, it's probably not going to be your kid who dies.
I'm going to say to mom, Scott, of the 42,000 people that have died, 41,500 of them are in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, or whatever the number is. Of the 42,000 people that have died, I don't know what the number is under the age of 10 or under the age of 15, but it is incredibly small. It is far smaller than the risk that they would take if they were going out in terms of traffic accidents. It's smaller than the risk they would take if it were even talking about regular seasonal flu, all of this stuff. which doesn't specifically tend to avoid younger children, by the way. And if you're telling me that America has become the kind of place where mothers are unwilling to let their kids out the door because they're afraid they're going to get sick, then we have got a more serious problem. Now, I'm not blaming the mother for this. I'm not blaming her at all, or the father, because apparently there's still some fathers out there. What I am saying is that this media irresponsibility of this constant running death toll without anything to compare it to will produce nothing other than this effect. If all you do is show an increasing number of deaths due to COVID-19, and you don't compare that to the same number of deaths from car accidents, from falling off of bicycles, from drowning, from diabetes, asthma, chickenpox, all of it. If you don't compare that to anything else, you do exactly what the media has set you up to do, and that is to have you think that the only way my kid can die is by having this COVID-19 virus, when everybody knows that's not true. And whether they want to face it or not, they know that's not true. When you send a kid off to school, you're taking a risk. When the kid gets in the bath to take a bath, you're taking a risk. Everybody's taking a risk all the time. And it's this childish, infantile, and evil, in my opinion, evil desire for ratings or political influence on the part of the media to do nothing at all, nothing ever, to put any of this stuff in perspective so that people can make a reasonable assessment of what the risk of this particular virus is.
But that's the reality of what the parents are seeing, though, Bill. Don't you agree that they're actually seeing what you just described, and to suddenly turn around and say, hey, ignore all that crap the media's been telling you all this time. It's really not that bad.
Well, if it were up to me, I could put together in a very short period of time a one-piece picture cardboard pamphlet without any text on it at all. And I would basically say, every time you send your kid out, here's the risk in terms of decreasing risk of what they face. And here's COVID-19. Now, if you're decided that your kid is not going to get COVID-19, and we talk about we put down here's the number of cases that have been serious in terms of young people. You put all of that down there and get that out as a public health measure on the part of the government, which is going to have to do the job that the media should have been doing this whole time. Then it's ultimately up to the parents. I'm never, ever going to say that the government should come to your house and take your kids outdoors for whatever reason ever. If you want to keep your child inside for the rest of his life, then that's your choice as a parent. But you have to give parents some kind of a statistical and reasonable grounding of what the risk is. And the media has not only not done that, they have done precisely the opposite from the beginning. And this is the failure. You can look at shortages of masks and lack of preparation here or there, or later early responses. You can talk about that forever. But the one thing that we've learned from this pandemic is the catastrophic total failure of the news media to not only do its job, but its spectacular success in doing its anti-job, in spreading misinformation, not by so much lying about the total number of cases, although there's been some of that too, but by doing things like saying that this whole hydrochloroquine thing is a complete bogus phony when it's clearly not. That would give me some comfort if I was a parent, knowing that there are therapies that have been shown to dramatically, in enormous number of cases, reduce the symptoms should my kid come down with a severe dose, that kind of thing. But mainly, we have never seen anything other than the death counter of COVID-19. We haven't seen anything to compare it to. We have no idea. All we see is this bar graph going like this, and we think, oh my God.
So, Bill, as far as I can tell,
we don't see what all the other bar graphs are doing.
You may want to hold the media culpable for all this, but I was just going through headlines today. I literally just Googled and said, show me the scientific evidence. In particular, this question was about the origins of this virus, okay? So yep. I do a search on that, and then I hit the news tab in my search engine, and I see the news stories that are written about it. And the division politically between the stories that are supposedly scientific stories was absolutely striking. In other words, there wasn't a single liberal news site that was saying the same thing as any of the conservative news sites. And I was Googling, or not Googling in this case, but I was using my search engine, And I was looking for a question that was specifically had to do with science. And so the reason why I pose this question this way is to ask you, who is this magical person who's going to stand up and bridge the gap across all political, ideological strains of Americans and be able to bring a common sense message that says, look, sending your kid out into public is not only probably not going to hurt him, but it'll be good for society as a whole, and we think you should voluntarily do that?
I'll do it.
You're a far right extremist.
I am a person who knows how to weigh evidence. And to the degree that I know how to weigh evidence, that influences my political position. But a far-right extremist, if you really want to go to the cartoon examples of it, if you really, I'm not saying that these are invented, but I am saying that these are the extremist positions. The extremist positions are the people who are saying this is nothing but the flu. You got nothing to worry about. The whole thing is a conspiracy and a power grab. That's what a far-right extremist is. A far-left extremist is somebody who says if you so much as step outside the house, you're going to die, the whole society is going to die, and better to ruin the economy than have anything happen to me or my precious loved one from this killer virus that's out there that's felling the entire population. Those are the two poles, and I've been walking through the difference. I've been walking between these two poles for well over a month now. And I am not the same ability to weigh evidence and to look at contradictory expert opinions and determine which ones have merit and which ones don't, or which ones seem to have more merit, is a skill that I was taught in debate class. It had nothing to do with my politics. I went to debate and learned that if I happen to get a coin toss and I'm on the negative team, I have to come up with 30,000 evidence points saying that capital punishment does not deter murder. And then if I'm the affirmative on the flip of a coin, I have to come up with another 30,000 evidence points that says that it does. And I have been able to find that for any single opinion out there, no matter what it is, you can put a line of experts on one side, and you can put a line of experts on the other side, and they both say, nah, the other guy's wrong. So yes, this is a problem. So how do you determine what's real and what's not? Well, I'm a right-wing extremist. Paul Krugman, as an example, is a left-wing extremist. He's an economist. He's a professional economist. When he was asked what the result of Trump's election would be when Trump was elected, the stock market had a significant dip. When would this recover, do you think, Paul Krugman? Paul Krugman, professional economist, said, well, my first pass answer is never. Well, it turns out it was 2 days, which is considerably short of never. So when I look at Paul Krugman's ability to predict things in the future, that particular prediction weighs my evidence against what Paul Krugman particularly has to say. And the more you learn about what Paul Krugman predicts, the more you realize that the guy is in fact...
All you've done is made my point that there's such a sharp divide between the left and the right that one wonders who is going to stand up and make the case so that it bridges that gap.
You're missing the point. You're missing the point. The point isn't that the left-wing guy is wrong because he's left-wing. The point is that particular expert has been proven to be wrong so many times that his opinion is worthless in terms of its ability to predict an outcome, right? Worthless. So to say that I'm a right-wing extremist is to say that I don't listen to any of this stuff, that I don't practice social distancing, that I think the whole thing was a scam, and I haven't been saying that at all. What I'm saying is that this is a serious disease and that we need to look at what the actual death numbers are compared to the ambient level of risk. And now we're on to this is the main entire argument, Scott. This is the entire argument. I can make it very simple for you. Every single time you wake up in the morning, assuming you wake up in the morning, because some people don't, but assuming you wake up in the morning, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. So let's say you make it through that hurdle and you manage to wake up in the morning. You don't die in your sleep. Congratulations. You have statistically shown that that's the most likely case for somebody less than 100. Now, every time somebody goes out into the world, there is an ambient level of risk out there. And we know this is true. We know that there are traffic accidents. We know that kids can be hit by cars. We know that there are school shootings. We know that there are people who abduct children. We know that there's any number of things that can happen to a kid out there. And all of this stuff is factored into our minds as ambient risk. We understand it. We've had a lifetime to deal with it, and we accept it and know what the parameters of it are.
But none of that is being called pandemic.
Well, let me frickin' finish. When you have a sense of what the ambient risk is, you become accustomed to it. And the ambient risk level in Russia during World War II was considerably higher than it is in Santa Monica right now during COVID-19. So people become accustomed to the ambient risk level because they can see through personal experience just exactly how severe this thing is. Now, as far as the pandemic goes, the pandemic has got people terrified because it has added a new equation to the ambient risk of life. They don't know what the risk is. All they've been told is that it is enough to shut down the planet. So they don't know anything other than to say that there is now some gigantic new risk out there that I have to protect my kids from. So far, so good. So far, so good. Now the question is, how big is that risk? How big is it? And to say that that's not the problem is nuts. You are perfectly willing to send your kids to school knowing they can get hit by a car on the way to school or on the way back from school or whatever. They can fall down the stairs. You're willing to accept that risk because you know the size of it. And what the media has not done and has spectacularly failed to do is to provide any sense of what that risk is. So when I say I'd be happy to do it, it's not a question of my political opinion. It has nothing to do with my political opinion. All I would simply do is say, here is a number and a bar graph. Here's the number of children under the age of 10 that have had serious complications as a result of COVID-19. If they don't have serious complications, in other words, it's less than a cold or they don't even know they have it, that's great. They're immune. Fantastic. Here's the total number in America of kids that have had serious complications from COVID-19. Here's the number of kids that have slipped and died in the bathroom during that time. Here's the number of kids that have been hit by cars. Here's the number of kids that have died of asthma. Here's the number of kids that have done this. And then people would be able to look at actual science. It's not even scientific. It's past scientific. It's statistical data on what the risk is out there. And when you find out that the risk of your child getting serious complications or death from COVID-19, I'm making this number out of thin air, but for the sake of the argument, when you find out it's 1/100th of the chance of them getting hit by a car crossing a street going to school, then you have some idea about the risk and you can actually make an adult decision. But we can't make adult decisions because no one is giving us accurate information. To the degree that accurate information, this is how you lie with statistics, is if you just simply count the hits and never count the misses. Here's the total number of people who die of COVID-19. Okay, how many people die of other things? The other thing that they're not counting is the misses. So here's the COVID-19 deaths. Well, what about the rest of deaths? Also, here's the COVID-19 deaths. Here are the people that recovered or never had any symptoms whatsoever. None of it is presented. It doesn't have anything to do with politics. It's simply got to do with look, an insurance company can do this much better than I can. An insurance company can take actuarial data and say that given millions of people over time, looking at the neighborhood you live in, so on, here's the chances that you're going to die of these things. And then you take a look at COVID-19, plug it in there, and you're going to find it's at the bottom, if not the very bottom of things that you should be worried about. Now, if you give parents that information and they're still not willing to let their kids out of the house, then what you get is you've got a bigger problem than a population that's immune to this particular virus. You've got a population now that has no antibodies against fear of any kind whatsoever. You've got a virgin population of terrified, hysterical people that have been made this way by the news media who never, ever, ever, ever provides any sense of perspective or anything else that would get in the way of their headlines, which always feature mass death and destruction. And if you really think that this is a COVID-19 problem and not a media problem, I would refer you back to the last 20 years of being able to watch television in the afternoon and having the news come on and say, are you secretly poisoning your children? Find out tonight at 11 on Eyewitness News. That kind of thing is what made the news media into the joke that it is. And it's not just a joke. It is a societal danger. It is a mortal threat to adults living in the world. And the ability to convince parents of the real risk here is something that could be done so simply that that not only do I not expect the media to do it, but my hope would be that somebody like the governor of Ohio or the Ohio public health system would lead the country in the rest of the way out of this panic of fear and hysteria and allow people to have a reasonable assessment of the risk. I'll just close this by saying that I've been wearing a mask in Los Angeles and I've been wearing gloves when I go out for things. And I do that because I have been convinced that this is a serious threat that has been essentially ameliorated almost completely by measures like this. And now that that peak of the curve has occurred, now we can start going out. And look, when we say start going out, that doesn't mean we can start going out and not be infected. That's not the point. No one is talking about this. The news media is so miserably bad at this. When we say we want to go back to work now that the cases are declining, if we start to ease off these social quarantine issues, the number of cases will rise again. Of course they will. But that was never the point. The point was, can we make sure that look, if we're going to say it's never this high, but for the sake of the argument, here's a virus that's never been seen before and no one's got immunity. For the sake of the argument, it's a much lower number than this, but for the sake of the argument, let's just say that everybody's going to get this one day or another. Somebody's going to expose to it and they're going to get this virus and they're going to have a mild case or a fatal case or anything in between. The entire purpose of what we've been doing, keeping kids at home and all of that, is not because we can stop people from being infected. All we're trying to do, and what we have done spectacularly, I might add, spectacularly, is make sure that we don't have so many people getting sick at the same time so that we flood the ability of our medical system to be able to treat these people. We don't overwhelm the system. That's the entire point of flattening the curve. It was never about reducing the total number of infections. It was really about spreading that number out long enough so that at no point does it ever exceed our ability to deal with it for the serious cases. And finally, when you look at how people get sick from this disease, and you look at the age brackets, it's pretty nearly people 80 to 90, here's a bar, 70, 80, half that size, 60 to 70, half that size, 50 to 40, half that size. Keep working your way down. But do they ever break this down into categories? No. 40,000 people have died. Okay. What does that tell you? It tells you nothing. It tells you nothing. How many people have died of heart disease? How many people have died of asthma? It tells you nothing. And it doesn't tell you what kind of people have died in terms of their conditions. I will simply say this, Scotty. When COVID-19 first came to America, the first fatality, man dies of COVID-19. That's what the headline said. I said, okay, I'm curious because I know how to weigh data and I have a basic idea of how to assess risk. I want to know who that first person was. If this is a linebacker for Ohio State, I'm going to be a lot more concerned about it. But it turned out that the first fatality was a man who was in his 70s or 80s, who was essentially on life support, was near death anyway, and it was reported as the first COVID-19 death. Now, I continued to watch the number of people and how they were dying and what the ages were, and that gave me a comfortable sense that the number of people who die of this particular virus, who are healthy, normal weight, not obese, not any pre-existing conditions, the chance of you dying from this is essentially zero. It's close enough to zero for it to be much lower than the other risks that we face on a daily basis. And if we are no longer able to make those kind of decisions as adults, we got a much bigger problem than a virus ravaging this population.
Our friends at the Patriot Post have helped to make this program possible. They would like to thank you actually in two free ways. If you click the link in the description below, you will first be able to sign up for free daily updates that'll come to you by email, some of the best conservative content on the internet. And then they're also going to give you a free copy of the Patriots Primer on American Liberty. No obligation on your part, and I think even if none of that free stuff were available, you'd be glad you did it. We'd also like to thank the members at BillWhittle.com, a growing troop of people who believe in the messages that we are putting out around the world, and in fact, we could not do it without them. They are actually making it possible for us to produce and distribute this content, and we're grateful to them. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.